We are now going to transport ourselves back to 1805 for just a moment. I'm going to introduce you to someone that you probably have never heard of. I'd be very surprised if you are aware of George Whitefield. Mr. Whitefield. Up here at the front of the church, we have a depiction of him right there. I'm going to transport you back in time. Again, as I said, to the year 1805. This will not be Mount Carmel Chapel. This will be the first Presbyterian church of Newburyport, Massachusetts, where the grand itinerant, George Whitefield, came to die. Let me introduce you to the man, in case you don't know. Who was George Whitefield? He was the marvel of the age, one of the most famous men of the 18th century. He struggled with sin, as all of us do, for he was just a man. But God had plans for this man. To understand the significance of what George Whitefield accomplished in his life, one must recall the state of things in England in the early 1700s. England had experienced what was to be called a golden age, uniquely inspired by the glories of the Christian faith. She had produced the English Bible of Tyndale and the English Church of Elizabeth. She had borne Cromwell, Shakespeare, Milton, and Donne. Add to this some of the greatest theologians Christianity had ever produced. And is it not too much to wonder why England in the 1700s was not considered to be the shining star of all of Christendom? But she was not. She was falling, and falling hard. England had become a land of spreading spiritual darkness. Theism prevailed, and cynicism ruled. What passed for biblical faith was trotted out only on special occasions, and then only to appease the unsophisticated masses. As fate went, so went morals. And in a land where Puritans once ruled, Lady Montague would quip that Parliament should prepare a bill to have the word "not" taken out of the Ten Commandments. Depravity had become the fashion, corruption the popular rage. Vice ruled the day and bred a savagery that festered even in the law. Many minor offenses were now punishable by hanging. And a new form of entertainment was born, the public execution. Crowds jeered, taunted, and gambled on how long the victim would last. The wealthy would picnic in their carriages while listening to the last gasps of the dying. It was a cruel and a barbaric age. Gangs ruled in many neighborhoods, and raging masses often went on riotous, looting sprees. The root of many of these evils was the national obsession with gin. Every sixth house in London became a gin shop. Gin, it seemed, solved everything. It was fed to infants when they cried. It was given to children to make them sleep. And it was consumed to the point of intoxication by almost every adult. It poisoned men's souls, making them lazy, mean, and vile. It is sad to say that many clergy also settled easily into this depravity of the age. This was noted by the French jurist and philosopher Montesquieu upon his return from France. He reported that the English no longer had religion. A converted minister, he observed, is as rare as a comet. Instead, clergymen spent their time on fox hunting, drinking, gambling, and attending plays. When the Bishop of Chester chastised a priest for drunkenness, the man protested, "Oh, my lord, I was never drunk when I was on duty." "On duty?" he thundered. "Pray, sir, tell me when is a clergyman never on duty?" King George even found it necessary to remind the Archbishop of Canterbury that his residence was not intended for gambling and whores. So England descended, and the church slept on. The rich grew distant and fat. Poverty spread like Black Death. Africans were enslaved in increasing numbers. Children were worked to an early demise in both factory and field. The innocent were hung or consigned to a living hell in rat-infested jails. Degenerate living filled the streets with urchins, skilled at crime and addicted to vice. Illiteracy and ignorance prevailed, while superstitions arose. And where was deliverance to be found? Well, not in the works of Addison or the eloquence of Burke, nor in the statecraft of Walpole or Pitt. It was not to be found in the satire of Johnson or Swift, nor is it to be found in a misguided church or a distracted parliament, and certainly not in the merchant class or the drunken angry masses. No, Deliverance would come from a public house in Gloucester, from a fatherless, squint-eyed boy laughably named for the king of the realm. It came from one who later would call himself a worm taken from a public house. But the important news is that it came. All because of the wickedness of the age and the prayers of the saints that reached to the heavens of the compassionate God. It is hard to imagine that you would not be familiar with Whitefield. After all, he was the most famous man in the 18th century. He captivated great masses on 2 continents by the sheer power of his oratory. It is unlikely that a person in the American colonies would not have heard Mr. Whitefield himself, as the grand itinerant had traveled the length and breadth of this unsettled land. He would attract crowds of 10,000 to 20,000 or more in a very sparsely populated area. And yet, even in cities like Philadelphia, which was the largest city in the colonies at the time, the numbers would swell beyond the population of that city. Yet Whitefield was not a politician, nor a military leader. He was not handsome, certainly. His eyes were severely crossed. Yet, the vast outdoor crowds that gathered to hear him preach, they could not take their eyes off of him. Such was the power of his ability to speak, and the power of his voice, and the power of his message. What was it about this man? He was the same as any other man in his youth. He spent his time on plays and living a wild life with his juvenile friends. And yet at night he read the Bible. This mix of activities tore at his soul because he knew he was destined for something greater. He just didn't know what it was. But God indeed had plans for George Whitefield. He was able to be educated at Oxford, although he had to enter as a servitor and be a servant to the other students. This was the lowest form of entry into Oxford. While there, he tried to find true religion in the duties of fasting, prayer, study, and worship. But this did not fill him with the intimacy that he desired to have with the Father. Whitefield eventually joined what was called the Holy Club, but still languished in spiritual emptiness. That is, until he read a book titled The Life of God in the Soul of Man by Henry School. And this lit a spark in him that would not be extinguished. It was as if he had been born again. He was ordained at the age of 21. And on the day he was ordained, the sermon that he gave won over the hungry while it antagonized the hardened. For the leadership of the Anglican Church was not as enthused with his theatrical style of preaching, nor with the message that he had to deliver. His were no ordinary sermons. He was theatrical indeed. He had been drawn to the theater as a youth, though he now condemned it. But it was there that he had learned the skills that he could now use in his service to God. He portrayed the lives of biblical characters with a realism no one had ever seen before. He cried. He danced. He screamed! The famous actor, David Garrick, who was perhaps the most famous British actor of the day, once said that he would give 100 guineas if only he could say, "Oh," like Mr. Whitefield. Benjamin Franklin once reported that he could bring men to tears by simply pronouncing the word Mesopotamia. Church leaders, however, were not so impressed. But in 1781, he stumbled into a development that was to characterize the evangelical awakening. While preaching from the pulpit one day, he realized that there were many who were not allowed to enter because they gave off an odor that no one could deny and few could endure. He told his friend John Wesley of his plan to begin field preaching. Well, Wesley thought he was insane, for outdoor preaching was not to be allowed, except, of course, at public hangings. A scheduled execution came along and gave him the desire to do what he had desired. A coal miner from Kingswood, Bristol, was to be hanged. Now, these coal miners were as violent as they were vulgar. Whitefield had a heart for them. The accused, though, as it turned out, cheated them out of their celebratory amusement by committing suicide. This was not to deny them, so they dug up the corpse and partied around the body in it. As I said, these people were 100% illiterate, stuck in degradation that defies description. Whitefield, however, walked among them in full clerical garb, and began to speak to them from Matthew 5, where he said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." His message was clear. No one else may care about you, but God does. These people found hope in what he had to tell them. The Anglican authorities, on the other hand, closed all of their pulpits to them. There were others who were more demonstrative. Angry mobs often attacked his meetings. His followers were beaten and robbed. Women were sometimes raped. He himself was clubbed twice. One lout even went so far as to climb a tree so he could crawl out of the limb and urinate on Mr. Whitefield. Many claim that he greatly inflated the numbers attending his revivals in an effort to gain publicity for himself and to increase the donations he received. Even Benjamin Franklin was among this number until he performed his own experiment. While attending one of Whitefield's sermons in Philadelphia, Franklin walked away from where Whitefield was standing and continued until he could no longer hear him clearly. He estimated the distance that he had walked from Whitefield and calculated the area of a semicircle centered upon Whitefield. Allowing 2 square feet per person, he realized that Whitefield could indeed be heard by tens of thousands of people, even in the open air. He declared that Whitefield's voice was a powerful organ, a beautiful instrument. In time, Franklin and Whitefield became close friends. They also shared many thoughts about the need to rebel against the British Crown. Whitefield preached that just as an individual needs to take responsibility for his own salvation, so must a nation decide its own fate. Whitefield preached that God is just and that he speaks to each of us directly. It was this freedom to worship God freely in this manner that brought the Pilgrims to America in the first place. And if we could no longer be free to worship God in this way, then a union with England would no longer be possible. Whitefield not only attacked the English king, but also the Anglican Church. He accused it of being dead in its faith. And there was more. Only a few months before, the church had issued a document insisting that no missionaries were to be sent to America except such as had had literary education and had been bred up with a decision to dedicate themselves to the ministry. Whitefield knew what this meant. Only Anglicans would qualify. English Christians would never be allowed to share their faith in the New World. Whitefield also knew that there had long been a plan to attempt to plant an Anglican bishop in the colonies, and this would make the colonies Anglican once and for all. He sounded the alarm. He wrote a letter published on both sides of the Atlantic, charging that the Anglican Church was more interested in spreading its influence than in spreading the gospel. And he warned his American friends. Leaders in America, like Samuel Adams, heard the alarm and repeated it throughout the colonies, making religious issues as much a cause of the hostilities as the oft-cited no taxation without representation. Whitefield's support of the American cause took other forms as well. He championed the colonial case against the Stamp Act. He accompanied Benjamin Franklin to Parliament to make the American grievances known and heatedly defended the colonial cause to British leaders. The very issues he raised would later be enumerated in Mr. Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. He increasingly merged political and spiritual themes in his sermon. He spoke often of liberty and the obligation of church and state to preserve it. As such, he helped the colonists envision a new kind of government, one distinct from the church in function, but equally given to the cause of truth. Whitefield made this part of the American dream. And know this, if there was no George Whitefield, there was no